Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the President and CEO of the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, Patricia Harrison.
Good afternoon. What a powerful video. And one of the reasons that we're here today, certainly one of the reasons that the Corporation for Public Broadcasting is here today, CPB serves as the steward of the federal appropriation, which is the largest investment in public media, the largest single source of funding for more than 1,500 locally owned and managed public radio and television stations, and we reach 98% of the American people throughout the country. So we talked about trust today, and at a time when trust in institutions continues to decline and the spread of disinformation is increasing, public media is still ranked as America's most trusted institution for news and educational programming. And especially if you think of programs such as PBS NewsHour and Frontline, our children's content that educates and also promotes respect. One small step which brings people together to discuss their differences in what I would like to say is a safe place in which to debate. And this content is so important. Think about the Memorial Day and the 4th of July concerts, where we all put aside our differences, we come together, we celebrate a shared history of this country, and we need more events like that. CPB has made a very long-term commitment to support content that truly educates and that informs. And for the past 15 years, working with PBS, NPR, and public media stations, we have invested more than $150 million to increase the capacity of local and national newsrooms and for international journalism. Right now, our journalists are in Ukraine, breaking through the disinformation as the Russians assault Ukraine. This investment in terms of information and our resources over a period of time have really helped us address different issues such as the dropout crisis, and it helped to move the needle over a period of time to increase graduation rates, and we were honored to work with John Bridgeland on that initiative. And so we're here today because we want to be part of this initiative, moving the nation on strengthening democracy. So I am announcing that CPB is increasing support for our American Amplified Journalism Initiative to nearly $1.4 million. And what this means is that public media stations in 26 states will now have the resources and the editorial guidance they need to develop frequently asked questions about elections and voting for the 2022 midterm elections. And we plan to expand this effort to all 50 states by the 2024 elections. We're also providing $750,000 for a 2-year reporting project through Public Radio's WAMU's talk show, 1A, Remaking America, and that's going to examine the forces behind a growing distrust of institutions that are really dividing communities and eroding our confidence as a nation. So we welcome this opportunity to be part of More Perfect, to really look at ways, measurable ways, that we can renew American democracy through trusted elections and government that is inclusive, participatory, and fair as we approach 2026, the 250th anniversary of the nation's birth. And now I would like to welcome our very distinguished panelists who bring knowledge and commitment to this discussion. What they have in common is years of experience working to strengthen our democracy. Please welcome Ben Ginsberg. Ben, please welcome Ben Ginsberg. Thank goodness. He's a distinguished visiting fellow at the Hoover Institution and serves as co-chair of the Election Official Legal Defense Network. He's an expert in election law and regulatory issues. He served as co-chair of the Bipartisan Presidential Commission on Election Administration, which produced a celebrated report on best practices and recommendations for state and local officials to make U.S. elections run better. Stephen Hines. Stephen? Stephen is president and CEO of the Rockefeller Brothers Fund, and he's devoted his career to strengthening democratic culture and institutions to better serve citizens. In 2018, the Academy of Arts and Sciences named Stephen one of 3 co-chairs of the Commission on the Practice of Democratic Citizenship in the 21st Century. Next, Brian Corley. Brian is supervisor of elections for Pasco County, Florida, but I found out that Brian comes from Brooklyn. Anyway, since 2007, he has presided over 70 elections with more than 2 million votes cast. During his tenure, the Pasco County Elections Office continues to be recognized for innovation, efficiency, and transparency in serving voters. And next, Julietta Henry. Julietta is director of the Milwaukee County Election Commission. She's responsible for managing all of the elections in the largest county in Wisconsin, and she has successfully directed recounts for the 2016 and 2020 presidential elections in the middle of the COVID-19 pandemic, and she also serves on the advisory board of the Election Official Legal Defense Network. So we have an incredible panel. Thank you all for being here. And what we're going to do, thank you. What we're going to do is turn to the audience. We have some questions, and we're going to begin with one from Harriet Myers, and she asks, how do we entice more people to vote? And then the second question is, why can't we all vote by mail? And let's start with Ben. Well, either one of those you can choose.
Thank you for having me. So we can increase the number of people who vote in 2 ways. One is poetry and one is practical. You know, there are barriers to voting that are put up in various laws, and you can get rid of those barriers and make it easier for all legal voters to vote. And different states tackle that in different ways, but that is one thing you can do in terms of making voting more accessible. The other part that's more poetry is the quality of the candidates that we have. And that's a burden on the political parties, really, but the better the candidates, the more people will come out to vote to support them.
Stephen?
So I think in answer to this question, how can we entice more people to vote, I'm going to offer what is probably a controversial suggestion. But Pat, you mentioned the Commission of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences that I co-chaired and that produced this report, Our Common Purpose, Reinventing American Democracy for the 21st Century. And it has lots of recommendations about how to make voting easier. But the one I'm going to focus on, which I think will maybe spark some debate, is we recommend making voting an obligation, like jury service, a universal civic obligation. This is a system that is used in Australia and a number of other countries to great success, that people are required to show up at the polls. They're not required to vote for any candidate or any party. They can choose to vote for none of the above, but they're required to show up. And if they don't, they get a warning and a small fine. You phase these things over years, but what they found in Australia is they get nearly 100% participation. And it changes the quality of the elections because the candidates realize they have to speak to everybody, not just the narrow slice of the public.
Do you have any hope for that happening here?
Not in the immediate future, but I think it was maybe Yuval Levin, who was also a member of our commission, an outstanding member of the commission, who said, if we give people a vision of the future,
yes.
This is where we will move our democracy to, and I think this is one of those ideas.
Well, we have Juliet and Brian, who I just think the two of you are profiles in courage. What do you think of this question, Juliet?
Well, as far as participation, it's education. It is important that individuals are educated and they know about the candidates that they're voting for. We have tried to encourage voter participation by creating a system where individuals can receive text messaging and email messaging from our office, and you can opt out if you don't want to receive thousands of messages or hundreds of messages. But we try to encourage individuals to just make themselves aware of an election and make sure that they participate in the election. And we have gone out to schools and worked with different organizations that work with young people to encourage their parents to vote. And it's just so many avenues in which you can encourage and to entice more people to vote. It may be hard after the 2020 election. However, I do feel that we have hope, and we know that individuals understand why we vote, and they also understand that individuals have died for us to have that right.
Yeah, I think it goes back to civic education and young kids and starting there. Brian?
Yeah, I grapple. We know this, the voter is the most important stakeholder, and we obviously want the highest turnout, and we're doing okay based on the historic turnout of the 2020 general, of course. And I grapple with incentives and compulsory voting, for example, but I keep going back to, I don't want to have begrudgingly voters kicking and screaming going to the polls. They should want to go. You talk about civic education. What I do when I speak to mostly just about voters, or just about to become voters rather, we have a program called Vote on a Veteran. And basically it's a way to honor veterans and their sacrifices by registering to vote and voting. It's honoring those who wore and wear the uniform. It's been said we've had men and women who have crossed oceans to fight for our freedoms. Some never came back, while others won't cross street to vote. And when I talk to our young future voters and soon-to-be voters, they get it. So I think having to motivate them to want to vote, I think, is paramount.
I love the fact that your dad was a cop in Brooklyn. I know that's a...
The 8-1 precinct.
Anybody want to talk about why we can't vote by mail?
Well,
No? Okay, yes, Ben?
seven states do.
Yeah.
They do pretty well. They tend not to be our largest population states.
Yeah.
But the real reason is that under our system of government, the time, place, and manner of elections is up to the individual states. And one thing we learned from the Presidential Commission you referenced is that one size doesn't fit all when it comes to our democracy. And I think the election administrators know that too. So states have the ability to do what's best for their citizens.
Stephen?
I agree with what Ben said. It's interesting that in the states that do have it, they find that it works quite well. And as we heard on the previous panel, with essentially no discernible levels of additional fraud,
Yes.
So I think over time, more states are going to be looking to, online voting as a possibility.
yeah.
They're going to be looking to mail-in voting. Anything we can do to actually make voting secure and easy is what we should do.
I think that's happening with technology. Brian?
I would say, shout out to Florida. We one size doesn't fit all is very accurate. Not only do we have in-person election day voting, we have in-person early voting for up to 2 weeks in addition to vote by mail. In fact, we even changed the request of my colleagues. The legislature changed the verbiage from absentee voting to vote by mail. We have a very sizable senior citizen population who felt the phrase absentee voting made them derelict by not showing up at the polls.
Exactly.
So changing the verbiage to vote by mail to denote it's one of 3 ways to vote went over very, very well.
And the same in Wisconsin, it's not referred to as absentee voting, it's in-person vote by mail. You're voting in person absentee. So you're just going to the locations that are open 2 weeks prior to the election, and you're voting in person, your absentee ballot. I also know that some people like to go to the polls. That it's a family affair.
Yeah.
They like to take their kids to the polls and then that encourage their children. I have a friend, she and her husband would take their children to the polls. Her daughter now is a judge in Milwaukee, and their son, he now takes his child to the polls. So it's important to note that everyone doesn't want to go vote by mail. Some people really enjoy that civic duty, and they like to walk around with their I voted sticker, and that encourage other people to vote as well.
We do like those stickers. I think we have a video coming up.
Hello, my name is Max, and I'm from Boston. My question is what steps should we take to encourage participation in our democratic process and improve voter turnout for communities that have been historically disenfranchised and underrepresented in the process? Thank you.
Thank you, Max. Stephen, why don't you take that one?
Well, I think that first, and I want to say civic education is really an important part of this, and lots of our speakers today have focused on civic education. I was in a third grade classroom in St. Louis, Missouri in 1960, and my third grade teacher decided to use the presidential campaign as a teaching text, as it were, and she just arbitrarily divided the class half to follow Nixon, half to follow Kennedy, and we had to report every week, and I was in the Kennedy group, and it was the beginning of my lifelong passion about democracy. And it made me want to vote as soon as I possibly could and every time I have the opportunity to vote. So I think it starts young. I think it is part of civics education. But then technically, we have to make voting as accessible as it possibly can be, especially to communities that haven't had it easy in terms of their ability to get to the ballot box. We have to open these vote centers. We have to do early voting. We have to do vote by mail when that's appropriate. Anything we can do, again, as long as we're focused on the integrity and the security to make the process simple, invites people to be part of our democracy.
And you want to see people who look like you at the polls when you go. And so for what he was saying, historically disenfranchised and unrepresented, that's been something that unfortunately has been happening. So you need to increase poll workers from all kinds of backgrounds. So they're there from the community, and you recognize them. Brian?
I think the key is engagement and educate. Engage the communities that have been underrepresented. You know, where two or more are gathered is my mantra. I'll speak wherever, and you name it, I've spoken there. And let those voters realize why it's important they care. You know, we're going into the midterms, and everyone talks about the historical low turnout in midterms, and I call it the irony of turnout, that those that are the local offices have more of a day-to-day impact, a county commission or school board, than say, a president. And yet the irony is ironic in that it's decreased. And so we need to explain why it's important that any voter, why they register, how they prepare and make a difference, and how their voice counts.
Juliana?
I do know that in Milwaukee, for example, they started adopting polling locations, allowing organizations within the community, sororities, fraternities, to adopt polling location, and it became a little fundraiser for that organization. And I think that was very important to do because it allows individuals in the community to serve the community. And I think when individuals, for example, the sorority that I'm in, we have a polling location, and they look forward to coming there every election, if nothing else, to see the people that are working at the polls as well.
That makes sense. Ben?
There's a responsibility on election administrators to be sure that the facilities, the voting machines, the ability to check in, the physical locations are uniform throughout a jurisdiction, which is very important. And then there's a lesson for all communities, which is in our politics today, the squeaky wheel gets the grease. And so that goes to the civic education of recognizing the stakes involved.
It's so interesting. Growing up a long time ago in Brooklyn, a lot of immigrants, and they were so proud to be able to vote. It didn't matter what the weather was. I mean, it was what you're basically saying in terms of Australia. This commitment was part of being an American. If you were an American, this is your chance to have your voice. And I think everything we're talking about today is to perhaps encourage that kind of thing again. It's not only a right, it's an obligation. We now have a slide coming up. Or, yes, we do. How do we restore integrity and trust at the local level of voting? You want to take that?
Well, it really is the question of our times.
Yeah,
In
it
terms of
is.
voting and in terms of what we've been talking about and in the great sweep of history that the first panel addressed. The reality is that our national debate over these issues is very poisonous and very polarized, and that on the local level, there is much more of a ability to be able to convince people in the integrity of voting and to trust in the election results. And one of the things you mentioned, the election official
Yes.
legal defense network, which you're on the board, but we have a program where we're going into the most contentious communities, wanting to get the pillars of the communities from all walks of life and across the political spectrum, together with the election officials, to explain exactly the safeguards in our voting systems, because I know Juliet and Brian will tell you you can't steal an election and you can check results and they're not fraudulent. But I think the way we have to go about it in the country, given the reality, is at the local level with election officials explaining and the leaders of the community being advocates for the sanctity of the election system.
How long ago was that founded?
About 6 months.
Okay.
This is our first cycle, and 2024
Well, it's very
will
timely.
be the...
Stephen?
I actually would rather hear from our local election officials.
Well, I would like to thank all of the poll workers, all of the election administrators throughout the country who has integrity. First of all, we have been working elections. Personally, I started in 1990 in the 1900s, but we have been doing this. We've had our boots on the ground, and I don't think I question the integrity of the election process. I question the integrity of individuals who's questioning the election. So we haven't done anything different. Elections occurred. Someone said at a panel discussion I attended a couple of weeks ago, they said it's easier to fool someone than to convince them that they've been fooled. And
Could you say that again?
it's easier to fool someone than to convince them that they've been fooled. And that was one of our coworkers from Philadelphia. And it is so true, because what we're finding now is individuals, we're doing our jobs. We have not stopped doing our jobs. And the poll workers, as well as the election officials across the state, across the country, we're going to continue doing our job. So nothing is going to change on our end as far as the work that we do. We're committed. We've been, we do it with a smile. Even sometimes it can be upside down, but we just have to continue. We just have to continue making sure that elections occur, because without us, you're going to go to the polls one day and you're not going to find the poll workers there.
You are one strong woman. Brian?
Well, there's two issues. There's integrity and trust.
Yeah.
Integrity, done. What next? Cross off that one. There is integrity. With regards to trust, if nothing else that came out of the multitudes of those who want to relive the 2020 election, they're asking hard questions, as well they should. But where it gets a little challenging is it becomes a giant exercise in confirmation bias. If I have a constituent reach out to me and wants to talk about X or Y conspiracy theory that's been debunked, if what I tell that individual doesn't subscribe to their existing viewpoint and what they've seen on social media, then it's fake. And it becomes whack-a-mole. You'll shoot on this conspiracy theory, well, what about this and what about that? It's never ending. And that's why I'm told I'm the first elections office in the nation to have no social media footprint. Everything we'd put out information-wise, innocuous voter information, would get hijacked by partisans going back and forth. And so we got rid of it, and we communicate directly with the constituents. And so, trust, I know I've had colleagues that have had open houses, A to Z, in an hour and a half, elections, including the logic accuracy test to audits and everything in between. So, I give tours. We're doing everything we can. What's frustrating is we went from having to refute outright misinformation from foreign adversaries in 2016 to trying to refute information from our own fellow citizens, and that's troubling. So we're doing all we can, but again, we're all stakeholders. We all have a part to play, I think.
Absolutely. We have a video.
My name is Megan Scott, and I'm a student at the University of Dallas. The particulars of election are essentially left up to the states. Should there be more federal regulation of our elections?
Who would like to take that one on? More federal, we voted for Ben.
Yes.
Well, look, that goes to the saying of one size does not fit all.
Yeah.
And federal legislation is by definition one size fits all. In the bill, the For the People Act that was before Congress, to give an example, there was a provision that said there would be 15 days of early voting in every state. Well, I think it turns out that there is no state right now that actually has 15 days of early voting. Some have more, some have less. The states adjusted that number to fit their particular circumstances. So I think it's too big a country with too much variation in the communities to have federal legislation really work.
Do you think, Ben, that there could be stronger kind of federal standards that could provide more guidance to the states?
Well, sure, but I'm not sure what those federal standards are, for example. And I think, you know, you get into the granular level of election administration around the country, and what we were told when we were on the commission is what election administrators generally do with the most troublesome situations is to turn it over and get suggestions from the citizens about how to solve the problems for their communities. And I think you would lose that entirely, really. I mean, I think one of the weaknesses of the For the People Act was I don't think they were talking, the people who drafted it didn't talk to any election administrators. That I don't know about you guys, but I heard extreme frustration with the actual people who put on elections about that bill because they were dealing in a different environment.
Ryan?
No, Ben's absolutely right. A lot of these, and equal opportunity offender, it happens on both sides of the aisle. It seems like, you know, politics sometimes hijacks election administration. It shouldn't be that way. That should be left up to the candidates, the partisans, et cetera, not the actual election administration itself. And a lot of those type of federal laws or proposed laws has that sort of political feel to it. And to me, that's just not appropriate.
What do you think, Juliet?
I agree with him because a lot of times, some laws, I believe, we should have standard laws, like you have to be 18 years of age to vote. But what I don't like seeing is after the 2020 election in 2021, you had over 352 new laws that were created across the, you know, the country that some of them weren't bad, they were bad laws that would allow individuals to become disenfranchised. And I don't think that's fair. That could, you know, something like that could occur.
Yeah, we have to be careful. The next question is from Emery McDowell from Dallas. Do you see avenues for bipartisan election reform that might balance imperatives of both electoral security and equity in institutional access? Oh, go ahead, somebody.
Well,
I think it's access, if I may, I think it's access versus security. We all agree on this. There should be no one that's pro-voter fraud. Everyone, the agenda is very simple. We want all those that are eligible registering to vote and 100% of those individuals voting. It's not rocket science. And with that, you want to have a level of security. As what I've heard stated previously, you know, it's not really where we are today. It's not difficult to register to vote. It really, really is in the grand scheme of things. And it's not overly difficult to vote. On the other side, there's not this massive boogeyman of fraud that's tilting elections. It's by all accounts de minimis. And so, again, playing to both sides, to offend both sides of the aisle, you know, having that access to the ballot box is important, and also having the security. No one is, again, anti-voter security or election integrity. So you have to have both, I think. And it's achievable, certainly.
Seems to be a challenge to get bipartisan anything right now, but Julietta?
We had a situation in 2020 where, because of COVID, and that sometimes people forget that we were dealing with that, there were a number of secure boxes that were placed throughout the city and throughout the state of Wisconsin. And in February, a judge came and said, no, we can't use those boxes anymore. We have to get rid of the boxes. These are the boxes where individuals can place their absentee ballot 24 hours a day, anytime. And by doing that, he also stated, and he did not have any conversation with election officials, this particular judge also stated that you must physically bring your ballot to your clerk's office or put it in the mail. And this really caused problems and issues within the handicapped community, as well as elderly. You have individuals who can't even, they're bedridden, and you have to mark your own ballot. You have individuals who are blind. So there are a number of things that impacted, and that's why it's so important that we look at election reform, because individuals are in silos. They're just making things up because they think they're hurting one particular group of individuals, but in fact, they're hurting the entire country.
Exactly. Ben, I know you wanted to say something.
Well, we're sort of caught in this country in a Gordian knot between fraud and suppression, right? That's the premise of the question. And to untie that knot, you have to sort of look at the reality of what the parties base that on. Republicans are worried about high turnout elections. Democrats are worried about low turnout elections. The truth is, 2018 and 2020 should have convinced both parties that that precept is wrong. But fraud and suppression, as the two sides of the same coin, is really kind of locked in through get out the vote messages that are just the historic provinces of the parties, and also the way a lot of consultants make money is the reality. So there is a way to balance legitimate concerns about people thinking that elections are accurate with the ability to provide enough avenues and ease for people to vote.
Stephen?
There is one example that is currently being debated, and that's a bipartisan effort to reform the Electoral Count Act. And that's an important part of this process. It has to do with the process of certifying electors after the presidential election. And as we saw, there was at least some confusion about what the process really is in January of 2020. And I'm encouraged that there are Republicans and Democrats in Congress talking to each other and trying to work on something to clarify, take the ambiguity out of that process. And maybe if that succeeds, that can be, you know, the start of other things that people can do together. I would also just point out that in this commission of the American Academy, we had a very diverse commission. There were 35 Americans from both political parties, from progressive to libertarian to traditional conservative, experts and activists, people who would run for office. And we got, after working very hard, consensus of all 35 members of this commission around a series of reforms that we put forward in the report. That also gives me hope, again, that in the body politic, I think there is bipartisan interest in improving, you know, our election system to make it both more secure and more accessible. And if we can build the support of people in their communities, politicians ultimately will follow, I hope.
I think this is what More Perfect is all about, hope and action. I'm going to take a moderator prerogative here. There was one last question. What role can business play in supporting safe and secure elections? And basically, we had a great announcement from the Chamber and Civic Action. And I think, you know, as running the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, I'm on the line to enable our employees to take that time off to be poll workers. And since I'm announcing it here, I guess we're going to have to follow through on it. You know, I spent a lot of time following John Meacham and quoting him, but there's one quote I wanted to share. He quoted Martin Luther King, and he observed that while the arc of a moral universe may bend toward justice, it only really does so when there are those citizens who have a passion for truth, a passion for we the people who make it bend in that direction. And I am very honored to be with the people on this panel who are doing their best to bend that arc in the right direction in ways that benefit we the people and our democracy. So I want to thank you all so much. Really admire the work you do. Please thank our panel.